For Chapter 21, Toward Empire. This chapter describes the Spanish-American War and the decision of the United States to acquire an overseas empire. America looks outward. America always had expanded, but expansion during the 1890s had several novel aspects. The United States now took strategically placed islands that were never intended to become more than colonies. Catching the spirit of empire. For generations, Americans had looked inward, but by the 1870s, there was a stirring of interest in the areas beyond the boundaries of the United States. As frontier receded, some Americans felt it would be necessary to expand abroad, especially in order to gain markets in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. The popularity of evolutionary ideas also encouraged expansion. Because these ideas taught Americans to view native people elsewhere as children in need of guidance, the missionary spirit was also still strong, as illustrated by the popularity of Josiah Strong's book, Our Country, in 1885. The reasons for expansion. Stimulated by a closing frontier and an expanding economy at home, the United States became increasingly interested in the worldwide scramble for colonies in the later 19th century. Advocates of Anglo-Saxon racial superiority exhorted expansion of American trade and dominion as both our duty and our destiny in civilizing the less advanced regions of the world. Foreign policy approaches 1876 to 1900. After the Civil War, the United States pursued an expansionist foreign policy. Under the leadership of various secretaries of states such as William Seward and James Blaine, the United States acquired Alaska and the Midway Islands and made unsuccessful attempts to gain Hawaii and Santo Domingo. American foreign policy was especially successful at eroding European influence in Latin America. The United States intervened on the side of Venezuela against Great Britain in a debt dispute and diverted Latin American trade from Europe through a series of reciprocity treaties. The lure of Hawaii and Samoa. Hawaii was a natural way station between the United States and Asia and therefore attracted American attention. A large colony of Americans was already in Hawaii when in 1875 the United States bound the island more closely by granting Hawaiian sugar free entry into the United States. This agreement ended, however, with the McKinley tariffs in 1890. Hawaii suffered an economic slump, and its queen, Liliuokalani, proclaimed measures to lessen the influence of Americans in Hawaii. American settlers pulled off a coup and asked for annexation to the United States. In Congress, anti-colonial sentiment was strong enough to block annexation until 1898, when Hawaii was made an American possession in the midst of the excitement over the Spanish-American War. The United States began its acquisition of Samoa in 1872, when it was granted port facilities at Pago Pago. In 1899, the U.S. agreed to share control of the island with Germany. The New Navy. Alfred Mann, in a series of influential books, argued that industrialism produced vast surplus of agricultural and manufactured goods, for which markets must be found. Markets involve distant ports requiring a large merchant marine with a strong navy. He warned that America was in competition with strong European states. Benjamin Tracy, who became Secretary of the Navy in 1889, supervised a program of naval construction that began to give the United States an offensive capability at sea. War with Spain. The easy victory over Spain in 1898 reaffirmed American belief that the special destiny of their nation. But the results of the war, colonies, and imperial responsibility disturbed many citizens. A war for principle. In February of 1895, another in a recurring series of rebellions broke out in Cuba. As Spanish tactics to suppress the rebellion became more brutal, American public opinion, stimulated by the yellow press, increasingly favored Cuban independence. President McKinley, while sympathetic to the insurgents, hoped to keep the United States out of war with Spain. The Spanish government made some concessions to McKinley, but resisted movement towards Cuban independence. The crisis intensified in February of 1898 when the Maine blew up in Havana Harbor. The explosion was most likely an accident, but most Americans blamed the Spanish. To pressure Spain and to prepare for war, McKinley asked for and received a $50 million military appropriation. Spain, however, remained steadfastly opposed to Cuban independence, so Congress took it upon itself to declare war against and Cuba free in 1898. Congress promised at the same time not to annex Cuba, known as the Teller Amendment. On April 25th, when diplomatic channels had obviously failed, the United States declared war. A splendid little war. Americans responded enthusiastically to the call for arms, but the small, regular army was ill prepared for rapid mobilization. Most soldiers fought in National Guard units, which often retained the flavor of the small town communities from which they were raised. Smoked Yankees. African Americans served both in the regular army and as volunteers. Their presence in the camps and staging areas in the South led a number of incidents in which black troops refused to accept segregation. The course of the war. The war lasted only 10 weeks. Almost as soon as it was declared, Commodore George Dewey crushed the Spanish fleet at Manila Bay. The United States suddenly realized that the Philippines were now open for occupation and hurriedly sent an expeditionary force. In June of 1898, the United States invaded Cuba, and after tough fighting, laid siege to Santiago. After a Spanish attempt to escape by sea was defeated, the Spanish forces surrendered. American troops also occupied Puerto Rico. Acquisition of an empire. The treaty ending the Spanish-American War called for Spanish recognition of Cuban independence, Spanish secession of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippine Islands to the United States, and a U.S. payment of $20 million to Spain. The Treaty of Paris debate. Promptly submitted to the Senate for ratification, the Treaty of Paris set off a storm of debate throughout the country. Members of an anti-imperialistic league argued that American acquisition of colonies would prove to be undemocratic, costly, and potentially harmful to the interests of labor and racial harmony. Proponents of imperialism repeated the economic, strategic, and intellectual arguments justifying American expansionism. The Senate ratified the treaty in February of 1899 with only 2 votes to spare. Guerrilla warfare in the Philippines. Demanding independence, Filipino insurgents led by Emilio Aguinaldo fought a guerrilla war against American takeover of the islands. Proving much more difficult and costly than war against Spain, the Philippine-American War, 1899 to 1902, convinced American leaders of the need to prepare the island archipelago for eventual self-government.